Before you see anything, you hear it. A low hum. Not an engine. Not bees. Something wetter than that. Something that seems to move, rising and falling like the barn itself is breathing. Neighbors on the county road outside Ashford Hollow started noticing it 18 months ago, always strongest on Tuesday afternoons, always coming from the same 11 acres behind a collapsing dairy barn nobody had used since the Ferris family sold the herd off in the 2000s. A few people assumed generators. One assumed bees and complained to the township about undeclared hives. A retired trucker named Wade Pelletier swears to this day he thought it might be a grow operation, and he wasn't the only one. He just wasn't the only one to think it and say it out loud at the diner. What none of them guessed is that the hum is coming from roughly 9 million living things, all of them eating, all of them growing, all of them fed entirely on fruit that 3 grocery chains, 2 juice plants, and 1 very large orchard had already thrown away. This is the story of a 26-year-old named Priya Anand, who took the ugliest, most worthless commodity in her county, rejected produce nobody would even compost anymore, and turned it into something the pet food industry and fish farms now compete over. Not through a recipe, through insects. And by the time you understand what's actually happening behind that barn, you'll understand why she never once tried to hide the smell and never once minded the rumors. If stories about people finding fortune in what everyone else calls garbage keep you watching, hit subscribe before this one gets going. It earns it. And drop where you're watching from tonight, because this one's traveled further than most. Part 1. The acres nobody wanted 2 years before the hum started. Priya was an environmental science graduate with a research assistant job she'd taken because it paid, not because it excited her, measuring nitrogen runoff for a state agency, filing reports nobody outside the department would ever read. She wasn't unhappy. She was just waiting, in the vague way people wait when they haven't named what they're waiting for. Her father died that spring and left her something she hadn't expected, 11 acres of scrub land in Ashford Hollow that had been in the family since her grandfather immigrated from Gujarat and worked it as tenant farmland before ever owning a foot of it. The old dairy barn still stood, barely. The fields had gone to thistle. There was no house, just land, a barn, and a well that still, against all odds, ran clean. Priya didn't move there right away. She drove out on weekends first, then more weekends, then stopped going back to her apartment altogether. She wasn't sure what the land was for. She only knew she wasn't selling it. 3 miles down the same road sat Ferncrest Orchards, a mid-sized grower that, like every orchard its size, threw away more fruit than it sold. Bruised drops. Fruit that split in a hailstorm. Whole bins that hit the sorting line one day too late and went soft before anyone could box them. Ferncrest paid a hauling company by the ton to cart the rejects to a regional composting facility 40 minutes away, a cost that ate quietly into their margins every single season and that nobody at the orchard particularly enjoyed writing a check for. When Ferncrest's operations lead, a woman named Deb Okafor, heard through a cousin that the old Anand land sat mostly empty with a young owner living on it. She made the kind of offer orchards make when they're tired of paying to get rid of something. Free fruit. All of it. Forever. If Priya would just let the trucks dump it on her acreage instead. Most landowners said no immediately. A mountain of rotting produce draws wasps, yellow jackets, raccoons, and eventually the county health department. Priya said yes on the phone, before Deb had even finished explaining the logistics. Deb has since told people she almost asked if Priya understood what she was agreeing to. She didn't push it. Free is free. Part 2. What nobody drove past without noticing the first pile went down that October. 6 tons of drops and culls, dumped behind the barn where Priya's grandfather used to store hay. She let it sit there for exactly 4 days doing nothing, testing something she'd read about in a research paper 18 months earlier and never expected to actually try herself. Then she opened a shipping container she'd bought secondhand and hauled onto the property that same week, and did something that, if her neighbors had seen it, would have generated a lot more phone calls than the smell ever did. She introduced roughly 40,000 black soldier fly larvae into a tray of the rotting fruit and watched. Black soldier fly larvae are, by most measures, one of the most efficient waste-converting organisms on the planet. They aren't picky. They aren't slow. A single kilogram of larvae can process several kilograms of rotting produce a day, converting sugars and cellulose that would otherwise off-gas methane in a landfill into their own body mass, protein, and fat, mostly, at a conversion efficiency that puts cattle and even chickens to shame. The waste product they leave behind, called frass, is itself a valuable slow-release fertilizer. The larvae themselves, dried and processed, are one of the fastest-growing ingredients in sustainable pet food and aquaculture feed, an industry racing to find protein sources that don't require clear-cutting soy fields or trawling the ocean for fish meal. Priya hadn't stumbled into this. She'd read about it during her nitrogen runoff job, filed it away the way you file away something interesting you'll probably never use, and then inherited 11 acres and a free, endless supply of the exact input the whole system needed. Her first tray failed within a week. She'd misjudged moisture content, and the larvae, deprived of enough airflow, died off faster than they grew. Her second attempt overcorrected, too dry, and half her colony simply stopped feeding. It took 4 more attempts, a lot of late-night reading, and one increasingly concerned phone call to an entomologist at a land-grant university 3 states away before she understood she needed to manage the fruit like a recipe: moisture, particle size, protein to carbohydrate ratio, not just dump and hope. By her 6th batch, something worked. The larvae grew fast, dense, healthy. She harvested them by the tray, dried them in a repurposed grain dehydrator, and mailed a sample bag to a small aquaculture feed company 2 states over, cold calling a number she found on an industry forum. They wrote back in 4 days asking how much she could supply. She didn't have an answer yet. She didn't have anywhere close to enough larvae, or fruit, or trays. What she had was proof that the ugliest, most worthless input in the county, apples nobody would even feed to a compost pile fast enough, could become one of the few genuinely scarce commodities in modern agriculture. A cheap, sustainable protein source that didn't require a single new acre of farmland to produce. Part 3. The hum gets louder. Scaling a fly farm turns out to be its own strange education. Priya converted the dairy barn's old milking parlor into a climate-controlled larvae room, insulated with second-hand foam panels she found through a farm auction listing. She built stacked bin systems out of plywood and hardware cloth because commercial larvae rearing equipment cost more than she'd made in her entire research job. She learned, the hard way, that a colony left unchecked over a long weekend can overheat itself into a die-off from its own metabolic activity. The same efficiency that made them valuable nearly killed her second real batch when she left for her cousin's wedding and came back to a container running 12 degrees hotter than she'd left it. Deb at Ferncrest, watching the operation from a distance for months with something between amusement and disbelief, started setting aside specific culls for her: softer, riper fruit that broke down faster and fed better, instead of dumping whatever came off the line. It cost the orchard nothing and solved a hauling bill they'd carried for a decade. Word moved through Ashford Hollow exactly the way it moves through every small town, badly, and everywhere at once. The hum got noticed before the business did. Someone reported a possible drug operation to the sheriff's department, who sent a deputy out, took one look at the trays of larvae, and left more confused than when he'd arrived. A neighbor 2 farms over asked, in the genuinely careful tone people use when they think someone might be in trouble, whether Priya needed to talk to somebody about what she was doing back there. She did need to talk to somebody. Eventually, a food safety inspector, an aquaculture feed buyer, a compliance officer at a pet food manufacturer who wanted to know exactly what her larvae had eaten before agreeing to a contract. None of those conversations were about her mental state. They were about tonnage. 18 months after the first tray, Priya's operation, she'd named it Hollow Protein by then, deliberately plain, deliberately unglamorous, was processing 4 tons of rejected produce a week from 3 separate orchards and a regional grocery distributor who'd been paying to landfill unsellable produce for years and were thrilled to pay her instead, for less than half what the landfill charged them. The larvae themselves were shipped dried, by the pallet, to 2 aquaculture feed companies and a rapidly growing sustainable pet food startup that put insect-based protein, upcycled from regional food waste, directly on its packaging, a line that tested better with customers, their marketing team told her, than almost anything else on the label. Part 4. What the orchard saved. What the Hollow grew. By year 3, Hollow Protein had crossed into 7 figures of annual revenue on an input that had cost Priya nothing but a phone call. Ferncrest Orchards had eliminated its hauling contract entirely, saving more in a single season than the fruit had ever been worth on the sorting line. The frass, the leftover larvae waste, sold on its own now, bagged and pelletized, to organic farms 2 counties over who couldn't get enough of it. The deputy who'd once driven out expecting a drug bust now buys frass fertilizer for his own garden every spring. Wade Pelletier, the retired trucker who was sure it was a grow operation, brought his grandson out for a tour last summer and left more unsettled by how normal it all seemed than he'd ever been by the hum itself. Priya still doesn't mind the questions. When people ask what's actually happening behind the barn, she doesn't dress it up. Rotting fruit, she tells them. Flies. Protein. Nothing anyone else wanted, turned into the one thing almost every sustainable feed company in the country is desperate to buy. What the story was never really about, in the end, was insects, or apples, or even the money. It was about the gap between what something looks like it's worth and what it's actually worth, a gap that mostly stays invisible because almost nobody bothers to stand in a rotting pile long enough to ask the second question. Somewhere right now, another truckload of something worthless is getting dumped behind a barn nobody's watching. Most people will drive past it without slowing down. If this one kept you watching to the end, subscribe. The next story picks up exactly there. And tell us in the comments, what's the strangest thing you've ever seen someone build out of what everyone else called trash?